What if the love you've always believed in was nothing more than a fragile invention, sustained by illusions that no longer convince? What if men's silent withdrawal from love wasn't weakness, but a form of resistance against an ideal that exhausts them? Nietzsche didn't see love as a place of comfort, but as a field of forces where desire and power intertwine inevitably. We live surrounded by promises of eternity, fidelity, and absolute surrender, but each day more people realize these promises wear thin in practice. What remains then is silence, the discreet retreat of those who no longer find vitality in old narratives. This withdrawal isn't merely personal, but philosophical. It reveals that perhaps love, as we've been taught, needs to be destroyed so it can be reborn in another form. Have you ever wondered if you still believe in love because you truly feel it, or simply because you fear the emptiness? If this kind of reflection resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and follow this journey. Romantic love is perhaps one of the greatest fictions humanity has ever created. It promises eternity, fulfillment, constant happiness. We've been taught since early age, through tales, songs, and films, that finding the right person is the key to completing existence. But for Nietzsche, this idea would be just another mask created by culture, a myth that weakens the individual instead of strengthening them. The philosopher distrusted everything that presented itself as universal truth, and romantic love wouldn't escape this scrutiny. After all, how could something so fragile, so subject to chance and transformations, be elevated to the category of eternal promise? The man who grows within this narrative comes to believe he must conquer someone forever, that he must offer impossible guarantees, that true love is unconditional and absolute. But reality, harsh and repeated, shows that relationships become exhausted, that passion loses its shine, that the other reveals themselves different from idealization. At this point, the myth exacts its price: frustration, resentment, and often silence. The man, educated to believe in forever, discovers that always is a prison. Nietzsche saw love as a vital force, but not eternal. It is intensity, impulse, momentary creation. It's precisely because it's alive that it transforms, and precisely because it transforms that it cannot be reduced to contracts or oaths. Romantic love, on the contrary, tries to fix what is fluid, tries to imprison what is untamable. It's like holding water between fingers. The tighter you squeeze, the more it escapes. This attempt at control generates fatigue because it demands constant performance, being the ideal partner, keeping the flame alive, sustaining the illusion that nothing will change. In daily life, this translates into familiar small scenes. The couple that pretends to be happy because they believe that's what love demands. The man who remains silent, facing discontent because he doesn't want to appear weak. The weight of having to correspond to an idealized image when in truth the feeling no longer has the same strength. Nietzsche would invite us to look at these situations without moralisms, simply recognizing the truth, that love isn't an absolute but a flow, that it's not failure when it changes form or even dissolves. It's at this point that many men begin to give up silently, not because they stopped feeling, but because they can no longer bear the obligation to sustain a myth. They don't distance themselves from love itself, but from its falsified version, which demands impossible promises and generates only guilt when they cannot be fulfilled. This silent surrender is paradoxically a gesture of honesty. It's saying without words that they no longer believe in the tale we've been sold. But Nietzsche wasn't a pessimist about love. He didn't want to destroy it completely, only liberate it from its chains. The myth of romantic love is one of these chains, beautiful in appearance, suffocating in practice. Upon realizing this, man has two choices. He can cling even more to the myth, trying to resurrect something that has already emptied, or he can accept impermanence and seek new ways to live love. This second option requires courage, because it means facing life without the protection of illusions. And perhaps it's exactly this courage that's lacking in most relationships. It's easier to repeat the ready script than to invent one's own path. More comfortable to believe in happily ever after than to accept that love can be only happy for a while. Safer to believe someone completes us than to bear the loneliness of being whole alone. The myth of romantic love protects us from anguish, but at the price of imprisoning us. Nietzsche would remind us that life isn't made to be protected, but to be lived with intensity, and that love, as part of life, must follow the same rule. To love isn't to cling to eternal promises, but to dive into the moment, conscious that it's unique and unrepeatable. This vision is harsh for those educated to seek guarantees, but it's liberating for those who have courage to face it. When men begin to give up on love, they often aren't abandoning the feeling itself, but simply rejecting the myth. This silence can be the first step to rediscovering love in its most vital form. Without illusions, without chains, without promises that imprison, a love that isn't eternal but true. Nietzsche affirmed that life is moved by a fundamental force, the will to power. This concept shouldn't be understood merely as desire for domination in the vulgar sense, but as vital impulse of expansion, of self-affirmation, of growth. In everything we do, we seek to intensify our own existence. And according to Nietzsche, love doesn't escape this logic. It isn't pure giving nor altruistic renunciation. It's also a dispute of forces, a game of affirmations and resistances. When two individuals meet in love, there's always an invisible negotiation. Who yields, who conquers, who maintains intensity. Even the most subtle gestures reveal this movement. The message not answered immediately, the expectation of being desired, the need to feel important to the other, all this is part of the game. Nietzsche wouldn't see anything condemnable in this, but natural. To love is also to want to be recognized. It's seeking affirmation. Even when we say, "I want to make you happy," at some level we're saying, "I want to be the source of your happiness." It's will to power disguised in tenderness. This perspective is uncomfortable because it topples the romantic illusion that love would be a space of complete equality and purity. If we're honest, we'll realize that in relationships there's always a dance of forces. Sometimes one dominates silently, other times power inverts. One becomes dependent, the other gains autonomy. This doesn't necessarily mean oppression, but rather that love is crossed by the same vital movement that orients all existence. Where there's life, there's dispute. Where there's desire, there's power. In daily life, this vision can be easily perceived. Think of a couple where one of the partners gives excessively, giving up everything for the other. This gesture, often seen as absolute love, can hide an inverted will to power, dominate through sacrifice, oblige the other to remain through effective debt. Similarly, one who demands constant attention doesn't want just affection. They want to be the center, want to impose their presence as indispensable. Even silence can be a gesture of power, used to manipulate or test the bond. Nietzsche alerts us, we shouldn't mask these forces under the guise of morality. When we believe that loving is being pure, surrendering totally, we create illusions that sooner or later break. The will to power is there, whether we admit it or not. And the more we deny it, the more it acts underground, generating resentment. How many relationships don't deteriorate because one of the two feels they're always losing, always yielding, always being drained? This exhaustion is precisely the sign that the dispute of forces wasn't recognized and balanced. This is why so many men today distance themselves silently from love. They feel, even without naming it, that they're trapped in power games they don't control. They're charged to maintain roles, to correspond to expectations, to sustain a performance of ideal companion. But instead of confronting this dynamic, they prefer to retreat. Silence becomes escape, but also protest. It's as if they said, "I don't want to play a game where I only lose anymore." Nietzsche, however, doesn't invite us to abandon love, but to face it without illusions. Recognizing the will to power in love doesn't mean destroying it, but making it more truthful. When two strong beings meet, conscious of their strengths and limits, love can become a space of creation, not prison. The problem arises when we believe that loving is forgetting oneself. For Nietzsche, this is a denial of life. To love, on the contrary, should be to intensify oneself through encounter with the other. Imagine a relationship where both don't seek to complete themselves, but to potentiate themselves. Instead of trying to dominate or be dominated, each recognizes themselves as their own force. There's no promise of absolute equality, because such equality is impossible. What exists is a conscious dance, where each admits, "I want to conquer you, but I also want to be conquered." This sincerity transforms the game into creation. Thus, men's silent surrender can be seen not as an end, but as refusal to continue participating in masked love. The challenge Nietzsche throws us is, do we have courage to love admitting that power will always be present? Or do we prefer the comfortable illusion that love is pure giving? Love as will to power forces us to abandon masks and face the bond as what it really is, an encounter of forces, intense and unpredictable. Not a refuge against life, but life itself in its most acute form. Nietzsche always distrusted inherited morals, especially Judeo-Christian morality, which molded the West with its demands for purity, renunciation, and obedience. In the field of love, this morality left deep marks. The idea of unconditional fidelity, of sacrifice for the other, of guilt when desire strays from rules. Love was caged within rigid commandments, as if it were possible to domesticate human intensity with laws and eternal promises. From early on, men and women were taught that loving meant renouncing themselves in the other's name. One who doesn't sacrifice doesn't truly love. One who dares desire outside the relationship is condemned as sinner. Even intimate thought, simple imagined impulse, becomes cause for guilt. This moral burden transforms love into a permanent tribunal, where each gesture is evaluated, where each slip is punished. For Nietzsche, this is a disease, overflowing life being reduced to obedience to moral codes. In daily life, this moral heritage manifests subtly but constantly. The man who remains silent about his dissatisfactions because he fears being accused of selfishness. The couple that remains together not through vitality, but through fear of judgment. The coldness that grows slowly, but is hidden under the appearance of commitment. Morality demands permanence, even when feeling has already been exhausted. The result is dead love, sustained only by obligation. Nietzsche saw in this dynamic a profound danger. Instead of strengthening life, moralized love weakens it. It transforms desire's potency into resentment. Instead of celebrating encounter, it imprisons individuals in fixed roles. Man, in this scenario, carries a silent weight. It's not just the expectation of being faithful or dedicated, but the demand to constantly renounce himself to sustain love's morality. Little by little, this burden generates profound fatigue, a disenchantment that doesn't need to be shouted, only lived in silence. This silence is often interpreted as coldness or disinterest, but Nietzsche would read it as a sign of exhaustion facing a model of love that no longer serves. When love transforms into duty, it ceases to be love. When loving means only obeying, man withdraws, not through inability to feel, but because he perceives, even if unconsciously, that he's trapped in a structure that suffocates him. And here arises a provocative question: Do we really believe that love and morality need to walk together? Or do we confuse love with obedience because we've been taught to fear freedom? For Nietzsche, true love doesn't bear the language of duty. It flourishes when lived as affirmation, not imposition. To love through obligation is a contradiction. To love because one must is a simulacrum. This is why so many men are withdrawing from the amorous field, not because they don't desire, but because they no longer want to sustain a moral theater that demands masks. They don't want to be punished for desiring, don't want to be accused for feeling tired, don't want to carry the guilt of not corresponding to an impossible ideal. Silence, in this case, is resistance against a love that became judgment. Nietzsche invites us to imagine another way of loving, without guilt, without weight, without the demand for eternity. To love as celebration of the instant, not as contract imposed by morality. To love as excess of life, not as duty. This horizon is frightening because it removes the guarantees that morality offered. But perhaps it's precisely this absence of guarantees that returns to love its most authentic intensity. Deep down, what Nietzsche tells us is simple. Love, when imprisoned by morality, dies suffocated. For it to live truly, courage is needed to liberate it, and along with it, liberate ourselves. There exists a silence that isn't empty, but heavy. A silence that carries within itself the weight of frustrated expectations, of imposed roles, of battles that no longer make sense. This is the silence that Nietzsche could hear in the masculine soul when we speak of love. It's not about lack of desire or inability to feel, but about profound exhaustion, facing a relationship model that seems to drain more than nourish. This fatigue doesn't shout, doesn't revolt, doesn't ask for explanations. It simply withdraws, step by step, until only silence remains. Masculinity, throughout history, was molded within contradictory demands. Man should be strong, provider, rational, but at the same time sensitive enough to sustain the romantic ideal. From him, absolute security is expected, but also unconditional surrender. He must carry responsibilities, but still show himself emotionally available. A role that, in practice, is impossible to sustain without leaving marks of wear. Nietzsche, who always criticized social masks imposed on the individual, would see in this scenario fertile ground for resentment. After all, the man who lives trying to correspond to external demands ends up denying his own vital force. This fatigue manifests in small daily situations. The husband who returns from work and instead of feeling welcomed finds only charges. The boyfriend who realizes his failures are transformed into constant comparisons with unattainable ideals. The man who, even giving everything of himself, feels he's never enough. Gradually, love's vitality converts into obligation, and desire, which should be natural, becomes just another task. It's at this point that silent surrender emerges. Not because he doesn't love, but because loving the way he was taught became unbearable. Nietzsche said that life asks for intensity, and that everything too heavy ends up crushing the spirit. Love, when overloaded with unreal expectations, stops being celebration and becomes burden. Masculinity, already pressured by other social roles, doesn't find in love a space of relief, but of more demand. And thus, in silence, many men withdraw. They don't say, "I no longer believe in love." They simply stop seeking it. They don't proclaim their surrender. They just let it manifest in gestures, choices, voids. This silent movement can be read in many ways. For some, it's cowardice, lack of courage to face intimacy's challenges. For others, it's weakness, inability to truly commit. But for Nietzsche, perhaps it was the symptom of a deeper crisis, the crisis of sickened love, which stopped being potency to become weight. Silence, in this case, is the most honest way of saying something doesn't work. It's important to remember that this fatigue isn't merely individual but cultural. We live in an era where masculinity is questioned, criticized, transformed. Many men feel lost between old demands and new expectations, not knowing where to find balance. Love, which could be a space of refuge, becomes another field of tension. Nietzsche would say, the solution isn't in restoring old roles, but in overcoming them. Love needs to stop being an arena of charges to become a space of creation, where each can exist without masks. The problem is that most men don't find language to express this malaise. Courage is lacking, but also space to speak about it without judgment. Thus, silence remains. The silence of the husband who prefers not to discuss because he knows he won't be understood. The silence of the boyfriend who feels the relationship as weight but fears seeming insensitive. The silence of the man who withdraws without explaining, because explaining would be even more painful. This silence isn't empty, it's contained scream. Nietzsche invites us to look at this silence not as absence of love, but as symptom of sickened love. Masculinity's fatigue isn't proof of incapacity, but of saturation. When love becomes performance, man withdraws. When love demands more than it returns, man falls silent. When love stops being encounter to become burden, man simply stops believing. But the philosopher also reminds us that every crisis carries within itself the seed of possibility. Silence can be escape, but also preparation. Fatigue can be surrender, but also the beginning of a new way of loving, more honest, more vital, less loaded with illusions. For this, courage is needed. Courage to abandon the romantic ideal, courage to challenge morality, courage to liberate oneself from imposed roles. Perhaps silent masculinity is just awaiting the moment when love can be lived without weight, without charges, without masks. A love that doesn't ask for perfection, but intensity. A love that isn't duty, but choice renewed each day. A love that returns to man what Nietzsche most prized, the sensation of being alive, of affirming himself, of overflowing potency. While this moment doesn't arrive, silence continues being the most honest language many men find. It's not lack of love, it's just refusal to live a love that no longer makes sense. The challenge Nietzsche throws us is, will we have courage to transform this silence into creation? Nietzsche always distrusted everything that promised eternity. For him, life is movement, flow, incessant transformation. Therefore, any attempt to fix something definitively is violence against existence itself. Love in this perspective cannot be reduced to an eternal promise or contract that imprisons two individuals within unalterable roles. To love with illusions is to seek security where only change exists. It's demanding stability in a field that by nature is unstable. Therefore, Nietzsche invites us to think love without illusions. Love without illusions doesn't mean cold love, nor superficial, but love lived with consciousness of its impermanence. It's recognizing that intensity doesn't need to be eternal to be true, that an encounter can have meaning even if it doesn't last forever, that a bond can be authentic even if it doesn't meet cultural expectations of fidelity and sacrifice. Living love without illusions is accepting that it's flame, and that every flame, however alive, carries within itself the possibility of being extinguished. In daily life, this perspective changes everything. Think of the couple that insists on remaining together only because they believe true love never ends. This belief, which seems romantic, is often source of resentment. Love no longer exists, but the promise's weight keeps both people trapped. In contrast, living without illusions would be recognizing our time ended, but this doesn't mean what we had was false. Nietzsche would say this acceptance isn't defeat, but courage. It's facing life as it is, without needing to invent justifications or hide behind masks. Love without illusions also breaks with the idea of completeness. The romantic myth tells us we need someone to be whole. But for Nietzsche, this is self-denial. Nobody completes anybody. At most, someone intensifies what we already are. To love without illusions is understanding that the other isn't our half, but an entire world that meets ours. There's no fusion, there's encounter. And encounters can be powerful even without the promise of being eternal. This perspective requires maturity. It asks us to abandon the infantile need for guarantees. Who seeks absolute security in love ends up transforming the other into prison, needs to control them, watch them, test them. But this control kills love itself because it suffocates the freedom that feeds it. To love without illusions is, on the contrary, to trust the instant. It's saying, today we're here, today we choose each other, today we want each other. Not because a rule commands, but because there's vitality between us. Nietzsche would see in love without illusions an opportunity to liberate life from guilt. How many times doesn't someone remain in a relationship only from fear of hurting? How many times is desire suffocated because wanting something beyond what was promised seems wrong? How many times is honesty sacrificed to maintain the appearance of stability? All these situations are born from the attempt to fit love into illusory molds. The result is resentment. Love without illusions, on the contrary, is direct, honest. It doesn't promise what it can't fulfill, doesn't ask for guarantees, doesn't create debts. It simply happens in the now. Evidently, this type of love frightens. For many, the absence of promises seems synonymous with insecurity. But Nietzsche would remind us that life never promised us guarantees. Death, change, loss, all this was always present. Demanding eternity in love is denying existence's own nature. The true challenge isn't finding someone who never changes, but learning to dance with changes without losing intensity. Deep down, to love without illusions is to love more radically, because it requires courage. Courage not to hide behind narratives. Courage to accept that the other can leave. Courage to live each instant as if it were unique, because it truly is. For Nietzsche, this love would be much more authentic than that sustained by empty promises. It's not less intense, it's freer. Many men, by giving up on love as it's sold, may be opening space for this more honest love. The silence that seemed fatigue might just be the prelude to transformation, the refusal to continue living within illusions, and the opening to love without masks. A love that doesn't imprison, but celebrates. A love that doesn't demand eternity, but that, precisely by not demanding it, makes each instant even more precious. Nietzsche would say this is the only love worthy of life, that which doesn't promise forever, but surrenders body and soul to now. Nietzsche saw in life a constant creative impulse. Man, for him, wasn't made to repeat customs, but to surpass them. Not to imprison himself in traditions, but to invent new forms of existence. This creative spirit can also be applied to love. After deconstructing the romantic myth, after recognizing morality's weight and the fatigue it generates, a question remains: what to do with love? If we don't abandon it completely, but also don't accept it as it was imposed on us, what's the next step? The Nietzschean answer would be: transform love into creation. Creative love doesn't seek to fill a void, but overflow a plenitude. It's the encounter of two individuals who don't complete themselves, but potentiate themselves. It's not about fusion nor dependence, but mutual affirmation. Each remains whole, and it's precisely by remaining whole that they can offer something to the other. To love at this level isn't to lack, but to create. It's not asking from the other what we lack, but sharing what we already have of vitality. In daily life, this love expresses itself in simple gestures, a couple that doesn't demand perfection, but encourages each other to grow. Two lovers who don't bind themselves to eternal promises, but each day freely renew their choice. People who challenge themselves to become stronger instead of diminishing themselves to fit the other's ideal. This love doesn't imprison because it's not based on lack but on abundance. Nietzsche would tell us this is the love of strong spirits, the love of free souls who aren't afraid of solitude and therefore can meet without cancelling themselves. Because only those capable of being alone fully can choose to be with the other without dependence. The man who loves as creation doesn't become slave, but partner. He doesn't ask the other to be his reason for living, but allows the other to be stimulus to live even more intensely. This type of love requires radical transformation of mentality. It's necessary to abandon the idea that love must be stable, predictable, guaranteed. Creative love is always risky because it's based on freedom. At any moment, one can choose to follow another path. But it's precisely this risk that makes it so intense. To live love as creation is accepting it can end and still dive body and soul into it. It's preferring a true instant to a false eternity. Nietzsche would say that at this level, love becomes art. Not art to be kept in museums, but living art, made of gestures, words, silences. Each encounter is unique work, each embrace an unrepeatable creation. Love stops being duty and becomes celebration. It's at this point that it stops exhausting and begins nourishing, because it doesn't charge the impossible, doesn't demand guarantees, doesn't transform desire into guilt. It simply happens as life's expression. Many men, by silently withdrawing from conventional love, perhaps are unconsciously seeking this creative love. By rejecting the prison of promises, they open space for new forms of bond. By refusing the morality that weighs, they approach cruder honesty. By falling silent, facing exhaustion, they announce another path is needed. This path isn't total surrender, but reinvention. Nietzsche reminds us that living requires courage, and to love creatively might be one of the greatest proofs of this courage, because loving this way is being willing to lose and find oneself at each instant. It's accepting that the other isn't possession, but presence. It's allowing love to transform us, not through obligation, but through potency. Men's silence, which seemed abandonment, can be understood then as transition, the end of a dead model, the beginning of more living love. It's no longer about asking how to keep love forever, but how to make love a space of creation. The first question generates fear, prison, resentment. The second opens doors to intensity, freedom, and life's affirmation. In the end, Nietzsche shows us that true love isn't that which lasts forever, but that which makes us live more fully while it exists. When two strong beings meet, they don't complete themselves, they overflow. And this overflow is creation, celebration, life in its highest form. We reach the end of this journey with Nietzsche, and perhaps now love no longer seems like a sweet refuge, but a wild force, unpredictable and precisely for that reason, so human. We saw how the romantic myth imprisons, how morality suffocates, how masculinity exhausts itself in silence. But we also saw that it's possible to love differently, without illusions, without false promises, without guilt. To love as creation, as encounter between forces that intensify, as flame that doesn't need to promise eternity to be true. Nietzsche didn't want to tear love from us, but liberate it from the chains that transformed it into burden. Love for him should be life's affirmation, potency's celebration, space of freedom. If so many men withdraw in silence, perhaps it's not definitive surrender, but simply refusal to continue living within a model that has already died. The challenge that remains is this: Do we have courage to reinvent love? Do we have strength to live it without illusions, as creation and not as prison? And you? What belief about love has imprisoned you the most until today? What city are you watching from? Comment below, like the video if this reflection touched you, and subscribe to the channel to continue this philosophical journey together.